Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. I'm here to talk a little bit, and I think some people have heard me ranting about this ever since I've been on the network, about owning your own business. The place to start is, let's say, 500 years ago. You were a cattle farmer, and you knew how your business operated. You had a really strong intuition to say, this is my property, these are my wares, and perhaps the king would come along and take your stuff. But you really had a strong understanding, a strong intuition about what your business truly was and what you owned. This preceded, even if you were perhaps a skilled laborer, or maybe you ran your own blacksmith shop, you really understood your materials, the elements that went into producing, your life's work. Your relationships were very peer-to-peer. Your deals were closed with a handshake, and you knew that there was a relationship there that you could trust and have strong intuition about how it was expected to pan out and what the repercussions would be if they didn't deliver, or whether or not you would trust the person in the future if you had a sort of less than positive interaction. As we kind of entered into the computer age, a bunch of people started running their businesses on computers. Now this will be really familiar, I think, to everyone in the Urbit ecosystem that has kind of thought about this growth from the personal computer to the client-server model and all of this. But sort of in the business context, maybe this evolved from a computer on your desk to a disheveled closet, maybe with some more old hardware. But perhaps it still kind of lived in your possession and was something that you sort of knew how it was put together and operated. Maybe as your business grew, you guys became a little more technical. You had an IT guy sitting in a closet somewhere that had some fancy servers that he really liked to run. But ultimately, a lot of people are now running their businesses and the software that runs their businesses in a data center somewhere with Google Cloud, Azure, pick your poison. This kind of has led to a situation where your intuitions are broken about where your business actually runs. Like, if you look at this picture, who's in charge? Nobody really knows what this relationship looks like. It's intertwined. They're middlemen, and I don't know, it's just a weird cluster. And so what really, I want to talk about today is kind of how can we fix our intuitions about what we might own from our business. Right now, if you were to go and start a new business, you might, first set up some bookkeeping stuff with QuickBooks. You need to do some file sharing with Dropbox, and then you hammer your way through email with Outlook. Who's hosting your website? How are you signing contracts? And you eventually get through this rat's nest of tools that are SaaS services that have endless end user license agreement things that you probably didn't read and probably have some fine print in them that says, hey, we can cancel your service or change it arbitrarily and at our whims. And you really will have started to build your business on services that aren't yours, that you don't really own. This has an impact in the way that you can actually sort of exercise your will through what you think is your business, because really any of these people can impact the way that you're making decisions. And it really gives you a set of downsides that you might not expect. Your system isn't built for what you or your customers need. It's built for the strategic direction of Microsoft or Intuit or JP Morgan Chase, right? They're giving you the tools, the capabilities that they want you to have, not the ones that you want to have. The centralization of these specific services creates incentive risks for how the data that you're sharing might be used, right? If you're running your small sales, little store on Amazon Marketplace, for example. Amazon's collecting huge amounts of data about you, your customers, and other little businesses like yours, and now they might undercut you with an Amazon Basics product that sells for less than your solution, and now it ends up higher up on the search lists and all of those things. And so that centralization is not just an individual level risk, but really at a marketplace-wide level, you're going to have sort of this centralization that strips power from your own business and really puts it in the hands of what you thought were service providers for you, but really are a little bit more parasitic. Your ability to say no to disruptive changes to your business changes. So I will rant a little bit about QuickBooks as a service. I've used QuickBooks Online for over a decade. They used to have a desktop app that worked fairly well and was fully featured and could do all the things that I wanted to do with it. And then one day they just said, we're not going to have a desktop app anymore. You have to use the online version. So now whenever you want to do your bookkeeping, you need an internet connection, and there you go. So you're more tethered down to what your service providers want to do and what's good for their business strategy, but might not actually be good for your business strategy. Again, there's sort of these connections are fraught with middlemen and who might be spying on you, selling your data, and if you think of the sort of cybernetic collective that all of this sort of information that we put online is, we might accidentally be wandering towards paperclip optimization as opposed to sort of human flourishing that happens at the scale of a small business that is really purposefully there for the people that are running it and working there, as opposed to publicly run companies trying to make money for their investors and wandering just towards a profit-seeking motive. My other kind of rant on QuickBooks Online, this is a screenshot of sort of the documentation for their API to connect to your CRM. There's a very odd little thing, which is they will not let you write from your CRM to QuickBooks for setting up a new project. It can only go the other way around. There's no good reason for this. There's another, there are plenty of other parts of the API that will let you write into them, but because QuickBooks wants to kind of have a little bit more control over the way that you're running your business, they just don't allow that functionality. So again, these tools that people are using to replace sort of core functions of their business because they're unpleasant to deal with and not necessarily the core expertise of whatever kind of operation you're running, really starts to hinder the way that you can deliver your work product. This kind of comes, I think, a little bit to thinking about what ownership really is in the 21st century. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, you can think about the labor capital. There's plenty of debates about economics and all this that we don't need to get into, but state and sort of physical force and legal frameworks to say, hey, if we have a dispute about who owns what, we're going to go into court and hash it out there. In the 21st century, sort of those the ownership things, while it still might include sort of labor and capital, the most impactful part of that is going to be compute and data, right? Data is the important capital a lot of businesses are building on, and compute is the way that you're sort of manipulating that data and turning it into valuable for your customers or the products that you're building. The physical force and sort of legal force are for protected data ownership. You can think about the Streisand effect, data being infinitely replicable. The more you try and starve that out with sort of traditional models, the less well that it works. Compute, on the other hand, is commoditized but needs to be properly managed and trustworthy. I think, Ed, you were talking the other day about how can you use ZK proofs and knock to then have someone run your compute for you, but know it's yours. Like, I think this is a really fascinating way that these things can start applying.
Mike's question.
Yeah. And so, like, how can you start to make that compute a properly commoditizable thing that you managed and trustworthy, and really sort of have that be something that you can offload, but still maintain a proper sort of ownership over. And then, of course, sort of if compute is inextricably bound to data, limitations of your ownership, if you're offloading these things, becomes increasingly risky. Coming from that ownership of your business, there are these sort of 6 meta business that is really important as you kind of go into the future to properly own, even though for the last, say, 10 years, you've been told by hey, this isn't the core of your business, offload it to us, we'll help you make it easy, we'll run it for you, and you guys don't have to worry about it, and you can focus on what makes your business special. So to me, these sections are sort of accounting and finance, security and compliance, talent management, delivery operations, and marketing and discovery. So these are kind of pieces of a business that really are across most every business are going to need to have. And a lot of people have offloaded them because they think, oh, this isn't actually my business. This isn't what makes my business special. What makes my business special is my creative talent. It's my great IP. It's my idea. But if you don't own this part of your business, the rest of it can fall apart really quickly because it's built on a bed of sand, right? If you're running, a small creative agency and your accounting and your security and compliance tools just no longer interact because of whatever SaaS provider said, hey, we're not going to use this connection anymore, you lose the trust of all of your customers. You're not going to be able to deal with paying your taxes properly. Like everything, all the wheels fall off the bus. I think this is where Urbit can come in and bringing sort of that layer of business ownership back into the hands of people that are owning and operating businesses. I'm making the case to say these 6 core business and the product creation and service execution side of things are actually much easier to do outside of your business or outside of sort of the core tools that you own, because that's really something that you're going to be iterating on much more rapidly rather than the strong sort of operational foundation that you would want to build on. This is something that is a project, is a huge opportunity for us to support. If we can useful tools that speak with one another in all of the awesome ways that we know sort of Urbit applications are able to interface, then you can have a core operation of someone's business that really makes it so that they don't feel tempted to offload this SaaS services that pitch them on their life being easier. They can have, I think this analogy has come up a few times, but like have their cake of an easy user experience, and then eat it too of like actually owning and maintaining proper control over all of the data and operations that they need to do on a daily basis in order to deliver strong services to their customers and clients. We all kind of know that at present, Urbit isn't the fastest thing, so you're not going to maybe do video editing on a moon, but what you can do is say, hey, all of these operational tasks we can run here, and we can do our sort of product creation and service execution things outside of our Urbit, and still maintain some of the benefits of our SaaS megacorp connections that Urbit's not quite ready to take over. Now, I think I'm inspired to make this a little bit of a Q&A. Like there's a lot of stuff to go deep on here, but to start, I want to ask kind of back out to the audience, how many of you have run or currently run your own business? Cool. Does anyone want to kind of share what they've run into, or like what part of this resonates with them? And
So prior to coming to Tacen, I spent about 3 years doing independent software development, contracting, had an LLC, and had this sort of intuition, like I didn't want to offload the core operations of my business into the cloud. And so my first pass was, try to do it all myself. I wasn't quite dumb enough to like try to prep business taxes myself. I paid a local accountant to do that. But, kept my own ledger in, a H-Ledger Unix program, and ran my own website on a DO droplet, basically everything in-house. And it sucked, and it took all of my time, and I didn't have family time or anything else. And so my wife in particular was very relieved when she said, "You're not going to contract for Tacen, are you?" I said, "No, they're hiring me on as W-2. I'm going to get a paycheck, taxes withheld. I don't have to do the accounting or anything anymore." So I could see the attraction of the services, but I think it would be, especially things that require sort of like customized push through stuff, like tax prep, right? You can go use Quicken or one of the other web tax providers to do your taxes, because they have all the business logic in, and they're keeping that sort of warehouse because that's their moat. So it'd be interesting to see if there was a way to let people still make money doing that while not letting them hold on to all your data.
Yeah, and I think like there's a part to this to say, maybe you don't want to deal with this stuff, right? Like you should want to let go of as much of this as possible. But how can you have a system where, if we go back to sort of these downsides, that mitigates as many of these downsides as possible, instead of the trade, basically making the trade that you make when you give up control of these things just better for the small business owner. And like my thought on this is, the smaller and sort of closer to the core that a business can be to the people that are working in it and running it, you're going to have like, you're not going to kind of steer quite as far off course of sort of having a human level interaction with your customers and clients, which I think it will just end up making the world a better place, because you're just more closely aligned with the will and sort of positive interaction of people who want to do good, as opposed to 17 steps down the chain of command, an employee that does something less than moral or less than aligned with sort of the directive of the company, just because they don't necessarily feel ownership and connection to what's going on and being produced. So I don't know, what size of companies people have worked at in the past and sort of how the difference is felt at, say a 40-person startup or a 5-person little, project versus, companies with 100,000 employees and where you're kind of just this cog in the machine and you can feel yourself being pulled ever so slightly away from the kind of things that you think are just and good in the world because of whatever corporate policy or something like that. Any other questions or?
I know that for your work at the foundation, you've been sponsoring and pushing for a lot of grants to try to build the tools needed, or to get people who are also interested in them to build the tools for taking care of those 6 meta primitives that you brought up. Just one thing that comes to mind, there's still kind of a bridge where people on Earth are used to getting their bills, invoices through these same SaaS products. So it seems like there's still kind of a bridge that would be needed temporarily until Urbit took off more. Do you have anything planned for that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like the clearest way I've thought about that is, actually I think it's right here, is the set of things and sort of the 6 meta primitives, and part of why I've come up with it that way is these are things that aren't dependent on who your clients or customers are. These are sort of purely internal decisions. If you're a creative agency and your client says, I need my files as, Adobe Photoshop files rather than Figma files, you kind of have to jump to, what your client needs. From a, internal perspective, your clients are not necessarily going to care where you do your bookkeeping, right? Like, and so this is something that you could, as a company, make unilateral decisions on that aren't dependent on, the specific product or service or customer set that you're actually working with, and sort of, then interfacing that way. I think there is probably still a lot to do in terms of how do some of those connections happen to make it as easy as possible. Say, does your project management software interface with Adobe Creative Cloud so that you can easily share files, say from your Urbit to a customer, or like, can you serve a customer portal site from your Urbit that then, your customers can interface? Even how do you get into, I think Midsum Salrux and I have talked about this on the Discord side, and we've talked about, Microsoft Teams, all of those things. How can you start having, say your chat and communications channels, while from your end they are, you're just interfacing with your Urbit the same way you would any other sort of task that you're doing on it. How does that interface with, say, a client's Microsoft Teams instance, so that you have all of your chat interfaces in one unified place that's a good experience for you, but it goes out to, however your clients like to communicate. But yeah, I think there's definitely lots of work to do there.
Do we have a standards process for meta primitives, kind of like BIPs or ERCs?
We do not, but that's an interesting question. I guess the thing that I've seen recently in the grants program, I think up until about 3 weeks ago, when someone had an idea and of what they wanted to go and build, no one else had gone and built it yet, or even kind of talked about it. In the past month or so, I've had a few people come sort of independently come up with ideas that are starting to get, close to, the same idea or potentially competing ideas. And so one of the things that I'm trying to encourage as a next step, sort of as the ecosystem grows, is how are people starting to, integrate the different applications and agents that you might have installed on your ship in a way that get along. I think that could be something that starts to go down this path of like, what are some of these protocols for how these tools interact and interface with one another. I think that's a good sort of thing to start thinking about now.
What strikes me about this slide it's basically the pitch for Rippling. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that company, and their sort of like ability to lock in customers is because all of these individual components of sort of the business stack are constantly changing, and so it requires a central player that can kind of deal with the complexity there. What's interesting about this is it becomes much more of a public good where you have kind of built the underlying foundation for it, and individual businesses will want to customize it in different ways. But it strikes me that there might be sort of an issue in motivating this work if there's not a clear profit incentive in the way that Rippling has. So curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think like what you maybe I think what Sif Latchard was talking about yesterday in terms of the sort of where Native Planet is going. I think what you want to do is have kind of open source and managed service options, because I mean, as I ran my own business, I don't want to do any of this either. Like even if I own it, what is important to me is that like my will over it is what happens. If I have to, if I hire an accountant or an accounting firm that sells me sort of my specific tax structure, business logic, and I don't have to deal with it, but it's all running sort of on my ship and my data is under my control, like I'm perfectly happy to pay someone to do that stuff. I just want it to be able to be exercised sort of in the way that I want it to, not in the way that QuickBooks doesn't want me to be able to talk to any of the other software that I'm running. So I think there's a big opportunity here to say, how's the software being built, but then what are the services on top of that people actually do continue to want and need because they don't want to do, their own security and compliance stuff.
So insofar as a DAO is just a loose collective of people that can manage financial assets in any way they want, and that basically like some kind of like C Corp with a board structure is quite lendy and extremely successful, and is in and of itself a social technology. So just to preface, like my kind of expectation is that we'll see a lot less like democratically type run DAOs in the future and a lot more C Corp looking DAOs in the future. And so more or less like questions that I'm kind of thinking through today that I don't really have strong answers to, but I'm curious, you seem to have thought a lot about these questions, is basically insofar as you can replace literal corporate entities and registered agents and all of these things with contracts that are executable, insofar as you can do that, I'm curious as to basically from the urbit perspective, how much of a need there is to kind of manage books or something in a way that traditional companies that do have reporting requirements that a loosely structured non-legal entity might not have. Basically, I'm curious as to how much like DAOs obviate the need for some parts of the stack.
I think they change the way that you might do like accounting and finance and like security and compliance. And I think to give a little bit of backstory from my end, I started a small marketing agency. We got acquired by a larger marketing agency basically because the ownership was sick of dealing with security and compliance stuff and bookkeeping things, and it was easier to just say, hey, we're gonna offload to this bigger company. They can do these things at scale, and while we had fun with all of the other things that we were doing, like this overhead just became so insufferable that like we're gonna, take the easier path. And then that agency that acquired us did the same thing and joined like a 500,000 person agency. So I think what you can get, in both the ways that these obligations change and how more of these things could be automated or otherwise sort of shift a little bit, is you're going to get smaller sets of individuals that manage to be able to stay independent while potentially still contracting with a larger set of DAOs or otherwise sort of traditional corps to do the things that big companies otherwise do. And so instead of having a 500,000 person company, maybe you have 50, 100 person companies that are exercising the will of kind of those 100 people that are members of each of those individual ones, but they happen to come together to do something awesome. I think like the Urbit network is a pretty good example of this, of like there's sort of shared incentives, shared interests, but a lot of different companies doing things, and there's an incentive model that points kind of in a general direction for everyone, and everyone kind of cooperates and gets along, but isn't directly tied to the leadership of any one specific company.
Sure. I think the case study or the kind of the area that I think of the most when I'm thinking of that kind of organizational structure is film. Insofar as like film is made up of, many dozens or hundreds of basically quite small companies that kind of are used to, like the expectation is that, there will be a very large amount of funding, and then they'll go and do a project, and spend say $5 million a day.
Yep.
But then at the end of the project, you end up with something and it goes and gives you 3x on the investment or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
So all those categories that you have listed there are pretty deep and involved things to develop for Urbit. Right now, I think the marginal, advance or involvement of your business logic into Urbit is much more basic. Things like basic chat, or in the case of Terrell, we've made some basic payment agents that we're using, or we have desired to host our own websites using our own app. So given that this heuristic of dog fooding is, I think, correct across the Urbit ecosystem, Tlon was using Landscape for internal comms when they were developing it, et cetera. What are your determining criteria for when you should just build something on Urbit versus taking an existing SaaS app? Where do you draw the line? For example, I know that the Urbit Foundation uses Airtable, not to out you or anything.
Yep. Yeah, so to kind of say this from two different perspectives. So one is, before I joined the foundation, I ran kind of the last project for my old marketing business with a team of all Urbit people doing all of our sort of communications, file sharing, stuff like that over Urbit, just to get a sense of like, where are some of these gaps of things that we'd want to do. And I think there's definitely a place to, I think you're right that like this set of things is fairly substantial to be able to get to, but you can do a pretty basic level of this stuff with the tools that are already existing today. So you could imagine using Studio to publish a customer portal, for example, that has weekly updates, right? And your customer just goes to this custom site that you've given them, and here's their status report for whatever project's going on. Your talent management stuff can go in like a contacts app. I've got someone putting a proposal together for that, of like, hey, here are my contacts. They might be on and off Urbit, and I can follow these things. So like these meta primitives can be very complex, or they can be very simple. Like you could do all of your accounting and finance stuff in Membrane, the spreadsheet app that's coming out, right? Like, so there's definitely space to grow, but in terms of, you know, MVP, you know, you can start playing with this stuff today. The flip side of it, and I think you mentioned sort of how the foundation's using Airtable. Like I always give Woolref Podlex a hard time that since I joined the foundation, I've got like more Google accounts and social media things than before I was doing Urbit. And I'm like, I'm going the wrong direction with all this. But I think the part of that for me is, you know, we get to go and build those things for ourselves. So the next step, and like if anyone is interested in taking this stuff on, is how can we start to build a CRM for the foundation? Like I've sort of started to spec this stuff out so that as we're having interactions with people, we're not sending them to a Google form or an Airtable form. They're using Urbit forms from like Nalex Dazrael and doing these things on their Urbit ship. So I think it's just, you know, you kind of have to bite off the pieces that are most important to you at the moment. And like, as the companies that are building Urbit, we get to, you know, do it first. And then once we can have an experience that's superior or even, you know, maybe not quite superior, but has, you know, a more solid value prop to the people that care about sort of data ownership, privacy, stuff like that, then you can start to continue building on top of that. I think DAOs are a good example of this. You know, I don't know if you guys have seen the Books app from Quartus, but like, so there's, you know, bookkeeping that is integrated and looks at the Ethereum blockchain that, you know, can get all of your transactions for any given account. You can append, you know, notes to it and you know, use it as any other bookkeeping application that you might use.